Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural webinar on U.S.-China Generative AI Competition by the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. We are thrilled to have you join us today for the start of a series of webinars exploring tech advancement in AI. Our focus today will be the dynamics of competition between the US and China in the realm of generative AI. And these two giants are shaping the world, and their strategies clearly hold global implications. As we journey through this webinar series, I also invite you to tentatively mark your calendars for 2 additional upcoming sessions. The specific dates and speakers will be announced later. In the second webinar, we will delve into the domestic economic implications of generative AI for China. Specifically, we will look at its potential impact on China's labor market within the context of China's current economic slowdown. Looking further ahead, our third and final webinar will explore the effects of export controls, sanctions, and investment restrictions on China's access to advanced technologies. Additionally, we will also analyze how these factors might affect China's pursuit of domestic tech advancement. But first, allow me to introduce our stellar panelists and myself to you today. I am Lizzie Lee, Honorary Junior Fellow at the Center for China Analysis at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Joining me today are Karen Hao, former tech reporter at the Wall Street Journal, Ziyi Yang, tech reporter from MIT Technology Review, Jenny Xiao, partner at Lunas Capital, and Qiheng Chen, a fellow honorary junior fellow at the Center for China Analysis here at Asia Society Policy Institute, and also a senior analyst at Campus Lexicon. Thank you so much for being here. In the first few minutes of today's discussion, we will explore the importance of AI in U.S.-China competition. As you know, today, AI isn't just a tech marvel, it's an axis around which global power dynamics tend to revolve. Its impact reach far beyond technology itself, influencing economics, national defense, societal shifts, and even international norms. So my first question goes to Qiheng. Qiheng, why has AI taken center stage in the strategic rivalry between US and China? And how do their tech advancement align with each country's broader global ambitions?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here, Lizzie, and thanks everyone for listening in. Speaking of AI, so we have to understand that it is foundational technology, foundational to increasing productivity in every industry, and that's what makes it so essential to China's goal of industrial upgrading and pursuing high quality growth in the future. And also AI technology has this dual use nature and has a wide range of military applications. And that makes it even more critical to the long-term goal of the Chinese government. And it is one of the areas that China actually has a pretty decent shot at catching up the frontier. And we also have to look at this thinking that, as we have seen from the internet economy, that if you are a technology superpower, and given the population of China, you're going to be an economic superpower. And with that, you're going to play an indispensable role in global governance and at the geopolitical stage. And the same thinking generalized to AI, leading from technology to economic and geopolitical superpower. And in terms of how the two countries are aligning their technological advancements with the broader geopolitical and economic ambitions, on the China side, so China is betting on quite a few strategic industries, and AI being one of them. It's kind of taking a quote-unquote venture capital approach. Even if China only has a 20% success rate at being very successful in 20% of those strategic industries, and that's still a huge deal. And China definitely has the resources and the political will to bet and invest in AI technologies.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Please go ahead.
And on the US side, it's taking a more market-led approach, although we're seeing the progressives in office and a revival of the industrial policy. so this long-term competition will play on in the next decade or even longer time. And just to set up the stage, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Fascinating. So, Zhe, I'd like to hear from you next. Given the rapid growth of AI, which sectors do you think are poised to reap the most benefits? And on the flip side, which sectors might encounter disruptions in the near future?
Sure. Thank you, Lizzie. Actually, I want to answer the second part of the questions first. I feel like right now, the industry that feels most disrupted or threatened by the emergence of generative AI is the creatives. You're talking about like marketing writers, illustrators, models, or even influencers who feel like they have long thought that like their industry cannot be replaced by machines, but now there is like a relatively reliable competitor, generative AI that can do their job. So that's why we're seeing a lot of the artists or like people who do in the creative industry fearing that maybe in a few years their job will be completely taken place by the AI. And then on the flip side, I think the industries that are mostly kind of trying to take advantage of generative AI are those industries that rely a lot on the creative work, but do not see that as their base. Like, I think one good example of this is like the gaming companies. Like, obviously, gaming companies need a lot of like visual assets to keep their games running. But at the same time, they usually outsource that to Illustrator. They outsource that to other companies. And right now, they feel like this is a great way. Generative AI is a great tool for them to kind of cut down on the cost, to cut down on the outsourcing, and to run on a better profitability model. So, which is also why we are already seeing, let's say in China, some gaming companies are the most kind of adventurous in terms of adapting and using generative AI technology. And also on the other side, I also want to say that not just industries using generative AI, but also industries supporting the development of generative AI are also very much in demand right now. So we're talking about chips, data centers, everything computing. These are the companies that kind of form the backbone of how the growth of generative AI, and they have a lot of great prospects in terms of their business right now.
Fascinating, great insights from both of you. Now let's dive into the state of China's generative AI development. As you know, they've achieved quite remarkable progress in recent years, especially in its capability. So Qiheng, back to you. How has China's AI development plan influenced its journey in generative AI? And where do models like GPT fit into China's broader AI ambitions?
Well, China has been looking at developing AI very seriously, as I would say, since about 2017 with the new generation artificial intelligence development plan, and that's set the goals for where China wants to be in 2023, 2025, and ultimately achieving global leading to be a global leading player by 2030. But I would say the frenzy of ChatGPT actually took China by surprise. If you look at the development plans, China didn't identify the specific technological path to achieving the ultimate artificial intelligence, simply say AI in general. And the ChatGPT path, which is part of the transformer architecture family, is only one of the several ways to achieving that end goal. Mm-hmm. And it was originally proposed by Google back in 2017 and has developed to this day what we see as ChatGPT. And it took China by surprise at the end of last year. And then we see investment pour into this area, and policymakers are also paying attention. So back to how generative AI like models fit into China's broader AI ambitions. And now I think China knows this is one of the areas they can bet heavily in. So they have a target to direct the satellite investment into. And this belief that if you know what you're going after, and China's state-driven model can have advantage in catching up the technology frontier, whereas the Chinese model does less well when the target is moving and is kind of exploring the technology, but don't really know where is the short path to success. So the success of OpenAI just point out a path for China, but China is still definitely quite far from the frontier and definitely has a long way to go.
Definitely has a long way to go. Thank you so much, Qiheng. Karen, I want to hear your perspective now. Can you help us highlight some of the notable milestones China has already reached in its generative AI recently?
Thank you so much, Lizzie. I think some of the milestones that we're seeing China reaching right now are quite similar to the milestones that we see in the US. There's really a mirroring effect that's happening across both countries. So when OpenAI first released ChatGPT, we then saw Baidu be one of the main companies in China that announced that they would try to develop their own version, and then they released ErnieBot. We've seen since then that there's been a proliferation of large tech companies, both in the US and China, and a ton of startups in both countries as well that are trying to catch up both to the other countries' companies and the companies within their own countries. And so you see things like Snap in the US that where they're releasing like chatbot features to their app, and then you see ByteDance release a chatbot feature to their apps. And with the open source movement that we've seen towards sort of a response to some of the more closed nature of AI models, we also see this mirroring of Meta releasing the Llama model open source. And then you see Baidu and Alibaba kind of responding with their own open source large language models. I think the two areas that might be more distinct for China, one is right now there's a huge chip crunch in China because of chip export sanctions that were placed by the US in October on China. And so one of the milestones that I think we should be tracking to basically figure out whether or not China can overcome this challenge is how many of these generative AI models are actually being built on domestic chips. And thus far, I think one of the only contenders is Huawei has built a large language model called Pangu on its Huawei Ascend chips. But that is still, it's a little bit difficult to tell whether or not China really does have a domestic chip that would be capable of bringing more generative AI applications broadly across the country. And I think the other thing is China's actually ahead in the respective regulation, which we'll touch on, I'm sure, later. But China's made more aggressive moves in trying to regulate this technology, both in some ways that we would not want to be learning from and in other ways that we would. And so that's sort of kind of the general landscape right now that we're seeing in China.
Very clear. Thank you so much, Karen. Now let's turn to the driving forces behind the tech advancement we see in AI, the institutions, the companies, and the researchers. Jenny, over to you now. Can you please shed a light on the major corporate players in China that are driving innovation in generative AI? And how are Chinese research institutions contributing to research and nurturing talents in this field?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. I think that's a really interesting issue to discuss. I think a couple of points that I want to make here. One is there's the usual suspects, the big tech companies of China that are pushing generative AI development, but it's usually more for product development and not for pushing the frontiers of generative AI. Mm-hmm. That's mostly because these corporations have been suffering quite a lot from the tech crackdown of a couple of years ago, and a lot of them were cutting their AI research and development teams a couple of years ago. And I remember just before ChatGPT came out, everyone in China, all the big tech companies, Alibaba, Tencent, all of them were oh, we're just gonna let go our AI researchers, or I'll get them to do product and do something profitable instead of doing AI research. So I think the funding from the corporate side, from the major corporations, is a little bit unreliable given how they are struggling themselves. I think in addition to the corporate side, the big corporations, there's a lot of startups in China that are trying to do generative AI. This has been a trend over the last 6 months or so, and a lot of people that I know have come to me or to other venture capitalists, and they were oh, I'm starting to AI company in China. Do you want to invest? And unfortunately, we don't invest in China. And we just said no to everyone. But there were a lot of people out there who were really interested in starting AI startups. A lot of people, at least like 10 teams, were like, "Oh, I'm going to become like the OpenAI of China." And my take on it is that they're not very consistent. So they're interested in AI for like 2 months, and then afterwards they're not going to work on this, which is unfortunately what happened, because a lot of these startups are pivoting, or they decided to like drop the whole idea of building Gen AI models altogether. You've seen like this really prominent co-founder of Meituan who came out a few months ago saying he's going to do a big Gen AI startup, and he's given up on that. And Meituan has like bought his Gen AI startup, and a lot of like prominent startup founders in China were like, "Oh, I'm going to like do an AI startup that builds Gen AI models," and a lot of them have kind of like rolled back their ambitions a little bit over the last few months. So I think this is a field that's definitely less hot nowadays compared with like 6 months ago. And on the institutional side, and like educational institutions and government funded institutions are probably playing a larger role in developing the fundamental technologies. And in particular, I think the universities of Tsinghua, Peking University, they're doing a lot of work. And also you're seeing like government private sector alliances, such as BAI, pushing out a lot of really interesting LLMs. And they were actually the first to go into the LLM sector before it was hot. They started pushing out models back in 2020. These are like GPT-3-like models, and they've been working on it for a couple of years now. So I'd actually say they're probably at the frontier of LLM R&D, whereas the corporations are more interested in the application side.
Right. Speaking of what corporations are interested in, are there specific products or use cases from these Chinese companies that have garnered attention from investors?
I think compared with the US, there is definitely a lot more, I think like the use cases in China are more concentrated. So everyone in China, like every other company in China, like Gen AI company in China, is a chatbot, and every other company is an image generator. It's just like very, very concentrated in a handful of sectors. And I think this is because their models aren't aren't as good as the models that American companies have access to, and therefore they're not able to build more complex use cases on top of their technology. So it's really like very, very simple use cases. And I think what is interesting though is in Silicon Valley, like if you look at how many people are building LLMs versus building applications, there's like a lot more people building applications versus building the foundational models. Like there's only like a handful of major companies that are building foundation models, and like hundreds of application layer companies. Whereas in China, you kind of see a lot of people are building on the foundation layer because there is less of a clear winner in the foundation layer. So a lot of people are like pouring money into building, the OpenAIs of China, trying to become an API company. Whereas like in the US, like fewer companies are doing that. And in China, there's like a lot of application layer companies, but these application layer companies are usually concentrated in a couple of very simple use cases rather than the complex use cases that we're seeing in Silicon Valley.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Jenny. And as we start to dig deeper into the unique strengths and challenges that China and US each faces and brings to AI competition, Ziyi, here's a question for you. How do you think the research landscapes differ between China and the United States? And how do the talent pools of China and US compare in terms of AI research and applications?
I actually think there are a lot of similarities between the research environment in China and in the US. There are a ton of research talents, and there are actually a lot of collaborations going on too, like research institutes working with each other. I will point you to a report published this year by the Stanford Human-Centered AI Center, I think. What they're finding after kind of like going through all the scientific publishings of AI is that China has published way more papers than everyone. However, in terms of like the impact, the citations, the US still leads there. So we are seeing that a lot of Chinese researchers are working really hard and very diligently, but they're still catching up to kind of the knowledge advantage the US researchers have. The other thing the report also pointed out is that even though there are still more collaborations going on and happening, the pace actually slowed down. I think that actually speaks to the larger environment of kind of like scientific collaborations, like freezing and slowing down, which I believe Karen actually can talk more about that. But yeah, that's like one of the things we're seeing that like actually they might go on more kind of separate roles from now on because of like the geopolitical tensions, everything else. The last thing I want to note is that I think in both countries, we are seeing that a lot of times the companies actually take a more leading role because there's a very high cost that comes with developing generative AI models because of you need to spend on chips that's training and running the algorithms. So sometimes the institutions don't have that much financial backing to justify spending on that years over years. And the companies, especially the companies that feel like they have a chance to be like the first mover or to have an advantage in the industry, they are actually more financially capable of investing in it. But we're also seeing like kind of like them then cooperating with the academic researchers, like funding their research in terms to like getting their research used in their product. So we're seeing like really a lot of them tangle together. But I think in this case, like US and China don't differ that much.
Not that much of a difference. Thank you so much, Zeyi. So Qiheng, I know this relates to your research. Can you talk a little bit about data accessibility and data availability in China and how pivotal is that issue, if that is an issue in China's progress or further progress in AI?
Right. So the conventional recipe for success in AI is talent plus data plus computing power. And I would say data is one of the three areas among the three that China has the most ability to mobilize resources and have control over. And China has been, in the past several years, have been engaged on the efforts to optimize the allocation of data resources, meaning that unlocking the data that are now used by one party and making that available to other parties that have a better use cases for the data. And we have seen initiatives to establish data exchanges to facilitate this kind of reallocation of data resources. But the degree of success, I would say, is still questionable at this point. To my knowledge, the vast majority of the exchanges still happen off the exchange, meaning that it happens directly between the two parties, not through the exchange. But China is also trying pretty hard at unlocking the value of public data, pushing government agencies to release public data for AI training and for use in AI applications. It's still work in progress, and but I would add to a caution to this conventional thinking that China sits on a vast trove of data is that China's PC or the internet ecosystem may not be as developed or as a long history as the US, that you may not have this an ocean of data to scrap from and to fit into large language models. More data is in the mobile ecosystem, which is more closed off and is controlled by the big corporations. And so it still remains to be seen if China is really abundant in training data for large language models.
Really important caveat. Thank you so much, Qiheng. Jenny, I want to hear your thoughts on this. You mentioned this sort of distinct path between the fundamental models, LLMs, and applications between US and China. Are there other sort of niches or specializations that each country is leaning toward at this moment in generative AI, as far as you can see?
Yeah, I think a lot of traditional trends that we're seeing in the mobile era also applies to the Gen AI era. Specifically in the US, a lot of companies are building B2B products. These are like products that serve other businesses. These could be like products for the financial sector, for healthcare, if you're serving like doctors, or say, you're serving lawyers, like legal tech products. Whereas in China, most of the products are 2C. So like these are like products that directly serve customers. And the big difference between these two types of products is that 2C products tend to be more hype driven. So people are like super interested in this app and everyone's like downloading it. Whereas like B2B products are more like, oh, we need to like do enterprise sales. We need to get all these like big companies using our products. And China has always been very good with the 2C play, but like very bad at 2B, because a lot of Chinese companies don't want to buy software. And this has been a bottleneck for Gen AI companies in China. And they're like, oh, I really can't sell software. No one's going to buy software. They only want to buy my product if I provide consulting. And this is a trend we continue to see today in the Gen AI era. On the 2C side, I've actually seen some pretty cool applications. A lot of people are building chat apps for gaming, like NPCs, and also people are building, I don't know, like AI girlfriends, boyfriends. That was like a whole trend a couple of months ago. And also people are building stuff like, like AI, like psychologists or whatever. And there's a lot of like really cool 2C products. And also in addition to language generation, a lot of folks are building video generation, right? Like short form videos. That's something that TikTok brought to the US. That's like getting pretty big in China. I've had like a couple of companies, come up to me and they're like, hey, I'm building this short form video generation generation platform or generation app. It's also a form of Gen AI, but like less talked about in the US. And like there's a lot more interest in that in China. But I just wanted to like double click on a question that we were talking about earlier, which is like data accessibility. I think what is interesting here is I heard a couple of companies tell me or like tell other venture capitalists that but they have exclusive access to some government data in China because they have like a close relationship with some sort of like government official, or they were guaranteed by a government, local government, that they can get access to like all of the hospital data in their province or all of the hospital data in that certain region. And that's like really interesting because for US companies, that kind of data is really, really, really hard to get. A lot of like health tech companies in the US are really struggling to collect data. And I think they absolutely envy the data access that a lot of Chinese companies have.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Jenny. We already sort of touched upon this a little bit, but let's talk more about regulatory landscapes in both countries. Qiheng, how is the regulatory environment in the US shaping the development and deployment of generative AI technology and also for China?
So the U.S. is still very early stage of developing concrete laws on AI. Still in the discussion stage of how to go from the general principles to very concrete harms, and to map out what existing regulations can be applied to harms originating from AI, and what new regulations specific to AI need to be developed. We have seen a kind of whole of government approach to addressing the governance of AI. You see quite a few agencies within the US government claiming that the AI fall under their regulatory power. Notably, on the discrimination and bias side, you have the joint statement from FTC and 3 other agencies. And also the White House, pretty notably, around the end of last year, issued the blueprint for AI Bill of Rights that basically laid out 5 principles and mapped out how local and federal efforts tied back to those 5 fundamental principles. And again, about a month ago, you see the voluntary pledge of several leading AI tech companies that they're pledging to having robust red teaming and also watermarking their AI products. So you have seen this industry-led, this bottom-up efforts coupled with the top-down, some of the guiding principles, and forming the early stage of the AI regulatory landscape in the US. But it's going to take quite a few years for the Congress to really materialize any AI regulation, if there were to be any. And in this vacuum, the tech companies would just need to navigate the water and having a robust internal compliance and risk management programs and helping shape the discussion on AI regulation.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Qiheng. Karen, I also want to hear your insights. In what ways do you think China's regulatory approach toward AI differ from the approach employed by the United States?
China is definitely much more aggressive, and it's also much more top down. Like Qiheng mentioned, that in the US, it's really driven bottoms up by the companies, but in China, it's the government that's really setting the pace on what they want to see generative AI used for and where they do not want it used for, or the ways that it should be developed and shouldn't developed. And we've seen this just generally in a lot of like cybersecurity and internet regulation. China sort of tries to keep up with the clip of technology development, in part because of a fear that when you have new technologies that could really influence the information ecosystem, they really want to try to contain that as quickly as possible. So you see in a lot of the regulations or the laws that come out, whether it's a cybersecurity law or there was like a deep fake synthesis regulation that was just enforced in January this year, you'll see this language like any algorithm or any generative technology that has social mobilization capabilities needs to make sure, like the companies need to make sure that they kind of button up their technologies and don't end up influencing the internet environment, the digital ecosystem, to misalign with the party. But at the same time, because of this aggressive clip, China has also been quite ahead in some other areas that are more aligned with sort of Western democratic or liberal values. Like watermarking was one that Qiheng mentioned, where a lot of US companies are exploring this idea of how do you inject some kind of digital fingerprint into these generated outputs so that it's easier to track on the internet, so that you can reduce misinformation risk. That's something that the EU has also introduced into their regulatory frameworks. And now that's something that China has also introduced, whereas the US still doesn't really have like a formal law at the federal level that is looking at requiring something like that. So this is what like some China policy analysts have sometimes told me is like the sweet and sour approach of Chinese regulation. Like you get a little bit of parts that you're kind of concerned by, and then other parts that are actually, it's very clear that China is listening to the global regulatory discussions and trying to pluck things from the EU discussions or the US discussions that they think would also be quite beneficial for their environment.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Karen. Another common question I receive about China's AI capability is the effect of the censorship regime, which can cast a significant influence on information flow and the direction of technology. So, Ziyi, your thoughts on this? How does China's approach to internet censorship intersect with its AI development? Are there instances of AI technologies being utilized or adapted for surveillance or censorship? And how does censorship interact with AI?
Yeah, so actually, when Jenny just mentioned that, like in the West, a lot of actually in both countries, a lot of the generative AI are used for like 2C products. So this means that everyone can access like the models and ask questions and get their answers. The problem that comes with that is that there's a lot of unpredictability when it comes to what people are going to do with the models. And that is a big risk for Chinese companies, because China has had this like very comprehensive censorship system that goes into basically every social media platform. So they also need to kind of like adapt that censorship machine into the emerging generative AI products that's going to introduce more like unpredictability, introduce more sensitive conversations. So I think what we have seen so far is that the Chinese companies have been very careful navigating that landscape, especially like there have been a lot of Chinese companies releasing their AI products, but very few of them have opened them like completely accessible to the public. They're going to require you to register with your real name. They're going to require you to register with a business entity. So they kind of want to control the risk in terms of like what people are going to generate and what people are going to attribute to these companies when it comes to like contributing in the production of this kind of sensitive discussion. So that's very interesting, and we didn't really see it here. The other thing is that we are kind of seeing how they approach this question from a technical standpoint. Like, do they just block certain keywords from being asked, which is more like the search engine, like the Web 2.0 censorship mechanism, or do they use something else to try to prevent the models from saying things that the government doesn't really want to hear? For example, I think recently Biden's released their, like a week ago or something, Biden's released their own kind of like ChatGPT bot alternative, and people have realized that if you ask a question, let's say about the Chinese political leaders, the Bidens will actually generate the answers first, and you kind of see that as they type the answer. And then once it's done, it will again block that and say, actually, this is like a politically sensitive topic, and we could not generate that for you. So this is like a new territory. Like, people don't really know how to censor a AI model, so they're trying all kinds of ways. But I feel like soon, like, they're gonna find maybe there's like an industry standard in terms of how to censor this kind of conversations. Unfortunately, I think that's gonna happen soon. And again, to another part of the question, I don't think we have seen much of like how generative AI has contributed like innovatively to surveillance yet, because it's still very much in development. But we're more seeing kind of a continuation of the previous challenges to freedom of speech, to access to knowledge, like replicated in generative AI, because all these companies are so fearful of the political liabilities that they may have for introducing models without having some kind of guardrails there.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Ziyi. Jenny, back to you. How does the general public in China perceive generative AI, particularly in the context of state censorship? Are they getting around it? Are they just complying with censorship? What are the workarounds? What are your strategies and reactions?
Yeah, first of all, I don't think a lot of general public are very concerned about the censorship. I don't think a lot of them are very aware of the censorship, including the ones that have like played around with these tools. Their reaction is, oh, this tool is like very dumb, right? It's not a very good chatbot. It's not as good as the chatbots in the West, and they're not aware that that's because of the censorship layers, like behind the scene. And actually, like, interesting anecdote: a Chinese CEO once complained to me that his chatbot can't even count from 1 to 10 because there's 8 and there's 9, which is, I always think this is a really funny story, but it also tells you how dumb the Chinese chatbots are. And I think, you know, the general public usually complains about it from a user experience perspective. Like, the user experience isn't great, the chatbots are kind of dumb, they're not really aware of the deeper causes, and if they are, they're probably used to it, because this is like what the Chinese internet looks like. This is what Baidu, what all the search engines look like. So it's not particularly strange to them. But I do think the AI community in China is very aware of censorship requirements. And this is one of the main barriers to them releasing better chatbots. This is one of the barriers for them to make better products and make more innovative uses of their products.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Jenny. So we are coming to a close of the formal discussion part of our session, but I really want to hear Karen's perspective. This came up during our offline conversation. We talk a lot about U.S.-China competition, but let's just not forget that there are still opportunities for collaboration. What kind of opportunities for U.S.-China collaboration do you see, Karen, between the two countries in the realm of AI?
Thank you, Lizzie. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this, because I do think that the competition lens sometimes dominates the discourse so much that we really do forget how much cross-border connection there is, and how much we should be fostering that in cases like generative AI, where it is a really transformative technology and it's going to be global and borderless, and you're going to want to have some kind of like international norms around it. I think in AI already, we've seen like AI before generative AI became the term of the day. We were already seeing so much US-China collaboration. There's this Macropolo study that showed that it globally, like a third of the AI talent comes from China, a third of it comes from the US, and a third of the talent in the US comes from China. So there's just looking at people-to-people flow, there's a constant exchange of ideas that's happening. And there can be continued collaboration on beneficial applications like AI in drug discovery, scientific advancement, education applications, financial applications, things that are just generally beneficial, or like helping combat climate change, improving healthcare outcomes. And the other area that I think cooperation is really important is the risks and the harms. And we've seen some efforts with this. The Beijing Academy of AI hosted a conference that Jenny actually pointed me out that brought together some of the leaders in China and the US on AI research. So Sam Altman appeared digitally. There was an executive from Anthropic that appeared digitally. There were professors from MIT, from Tsinghua, from Baidu, from all of the major firms that were talking about some of the ethics and harms and making sure that together, like these two big AI superpowers are actually communicating with one another on what should be the guardrails moving forward for developing this technology. So I think both the benefits and the risks are really, really important areas of cooperation.
Fascinating. Qiheng, the world is not just the United States and China. How might other countries, position themselves in this whole US-China AI competition or collaboration? Where are the other countries in the picture?
Right. So my base case is that the technology companies will come from China and the US. Mm-hmm. And then the rest of the countries will just need to see where you are standing. So EU will still be super relevant because of its regulatory power and competency. And you may also have some other developed countries that have a very open system of open engagement with the United States that's going to benefit from access to US AI technologies, while also open to governance cooperation with EU and the US. And then you may also have another group of countries that I think the top concern is more about equal access to AI technology. So that's one dimension of looking at where other countries sit. And another dimension is looking through the lens of geopolitics. I'm quite worried about that we're going to see a bifurcation of the AI ecosystem. One is US-led and one is China-led, and we don't see much interaction between the two, not just in terms of talent and technology, but also in terms of governance. And you seek governments that may have a demand for censorship technologies may resort to Chinese companies to fulfill that demand. And this bifurcation will have much wider implication in terms of the global AI governance.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Qiheng. Karen, back to you again. What are some of the ethical and societal considerations both countries should prioritize as they advance in the realm of AI?
There are so many. Well, one thing that's top of mind for, I think, a lot of people right now is this challenge around misinformation. So a lot of these generative AI tools, they are not truthful because there is no sort of knowledge base that it's drawing upon. This is called hallucinations in the technical world. So that's a problem that really needs to be thought about. Just whoever is developing generative AI tools, whether it's US, China, or elsewhere. Also, protecting workers' rights. I think we're seeing a really big wave now of, like with the protests in Hollywood, of workers in many industries feeling a lot of squeeze. So you also mentioned like influencers feeling this pressure where they think that they could be replaced by generative AI, or even the threat of being replaced is starting to put pressure on their wages, their job security, their economic outcomes. So those are areas that I think both technologists and policymakers leaders around the world should really be collaborating on to figure out how do we ensure that as we move into an increasingly automated generative world, that we still have dignified long-term jobs. And I think the last that I'll mention is like data privacy and consent. Like there's also a really big global debate now around whether or not we should be allowing all of our data to be consumed by these technologies to create them. And artists are kind of protesting this, journalists are protesting this, and comedians, actors that are all sort of challenging this idea that their content that they put online under different circumstances should then be just used wholesale in the production of these technologies. So I think that's another area that, regardless of where these tools are developed, and even for jurisdictions that aren't necessarily developing the tools, but are actively thinking about how to regulate when the tools come to their jurisdictions, that should be a really big area that should be sorted out.
Looking into the future a little bit, Jenny, what disruptions or innovations could emerge on the global tech landscape due to US-China competition, due to development of AI, as far as you can see?
Yeah, I'll talk about disruptions first. Just going back to Chi Heng's point that there might be a bifurcation in the AI world between the US and China. There's going to be like a US AI sphere, and then there's a China-led AI sphere. I have no doubt that that's going to happen. And in fact, this is already happening. Just give you like a very, very concrete example. Nowadays, it is almost not impossible, like very, very, very hard for like US investors to invest in China. And this has like a couple of downstream effects. One is China's AI landscape is really going to lack the venture capital that's needed to grow a lot of these applications. A lot of funds in China that have like a very strong AI focus are telling me that, oh, they can't raise capital from the US, but because traditionally 90% or 70% of their capital, their money comes from US university endowments. And these endowments are pulling out of China-based funds because of national security risk, and because I think the Biden administration came up with a couple of policies that prevent American investors from investing in China. And also, there's this very big venture fund in China that is also like a branch of a U.S. fund that received a letter from Congress a couple of weeks ago, warning them about investing in China, and also like asking them to appear in front of Congress to explain what exactly they're investing in and what they're doing. So on the capital side, I already see these as two distinct spheres. It's very hard for Chinese investors to invest in the U.S. either, because there's like all sorts of KYC rules that U.S. AI companies put in place, and these are like KYC, know your customer. That means they have to do background checks on all of the investors. And the U.S. has a lot of like very strong like investment restrictions for China-based investors investing in the U.S. So like I really think these are like two very distinct spheres. A lot of American companies are suspicious of people with Chinese work experience, especially if they work for like ByteDance or Baidu. They're always worried, are you going to like steal my technology and give it to a China-based company? So I think there's going to be a lot of disruption, and there's going to be two spheres. And on the innovation side, I think what's interesting is I think the competition is definitely pushing hardware innovation in China, as all of these companies are switching in China. These China-based companies are switching to their domestically produced hardware. That pushes innovation on the China side. And also on the American side, because there's this risk or fear of China, a lot of government agencies are pouring more money into supporting AI research, especially like fundamental research. And I think, there might be interesting innovations that are coming out from this competition, but I'm more worried about the potential for a US-China AI arms race.
With that, that concludes the first part of our discussion today. Now let's turn to some questions from the audience. The first question is for Ziyi. What are the other strategic industries in China besides AI?
Sorry, is this about kind of like what other industries could utilize AI more? That's how I understand the question.
So I think the question is about the other strategic industries in China.
So not outside of AI.
Yes, outside of AI.
Right. I think right now, I mean, Chinese tech companies are already having a moment because they have a lot of influence. They have a lot of users in China and also sometimes outside the countries too. I think a few industries that I really focus on, one is electric vehicles. China is kind of like the world leader on that. It's like years ahead to a lot of the other countries. So that's one industry where you can see really kind of the energy transition happening in real time. And you kind of can use that as the example to see how other parts of the world will kind of answer to the question of energy transition. Other things, I would say chips. Chinese government has made it very clear that it really wants to invest in chips, not just for AI, but for a lot of other uses too. So how are Chinese companies going to rise up to the challenge or not? How are they actually going to kind of challenge the current Western domination in terms of chip manufacturing? That's also another interesting thing to look at. The last industry I will mention is just that there are a lot of like the to consumer tech industries in China. They are really prosperous because there's just like a huge user base in China, like 1.4 billion people. The great example is e-commerce. Chinese e-commerce companies, platforms are very developed, have very comprehensive features when you compare it to, let's say, Amazon. So that's also a front where you're really seeing like have a lot of the technology innovations, including generative AI, like being applied to real world use cases like very soon, basically like as the first adopters of these technologies. So yeah, this kind of like two consumer, very human labor intensive in tech industries. I think those are very interesting to watch too.
Fascinating. We have another question from our audience for Karen. Do you have a take on the state of non-generative AI in China, like pattern recognition, decision support, etc.? For example, the application cases could be autonomous driving, cars, drones, etc. Where are China currently in those fields?
Yeah, I think AI is non-generative AI has sort of, in the same way that it has in the US, sort of just become kind of part of the digital infrastructure in China now. It's sort of hard to point out any application that doesn't use some kind of pattern recognition or some kind of machine learning that's happening. And I think this is where sometimes when I talk with Chinese developers or engineers in the like consumer app spaces, not for generative AI, but like ByteDance, there's always this question of like, oh, is there something about the AI that is super ahead in China that is making ByteDance have like a stronger recommendation algorithm or something like that makes it become really viral globally? And this is where it becomes like, often people say that it's not really about the AI, like the people working on the technology, they're like, it's not about the AI at that point, because once AI is infrastructure, it's kind of commoditized. Everyone kind of has similar versions of it. And at that point, it's actually more just the product design, the user experience, all of the other different features that are being put into these technologies. I think the flip side of that is when it comes to something like autonomous driving, which is like, it's like a different category of AI applications. This is where, again, it's not necessarily about the AI, it's actually about the policy that is leading China to potentially start getting ahead, because in self-driving cars, a lot of automakers mention that they actually need regulation for this particular application to advance, so that they know what kind of safety guidelines they should be designing to on the roads, and they have some kind of framework for essentially the blame of what happens in an accident. And China has been more aggressive about pushing out these kinds of regulatory frameworks, which enables more innovation in that space. So I think, I guess to answer the question, like if you were to compare the US and China on like non-generative AI technologies, it's kind of almost the same now in terms of the actual technical infrastructure. But the ways that we're starting to see differentiation is from the other aspects of the technology development, whether it's the regulatory environment or the like user experience, product design aspect of things.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Karen. Another question from the audience for Jenny. How should young people get prepared?
Prepared for
like
AI
for like AI field future, I guess this is a kind of a job security question.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'd say like just get into AI. That's my biggest piece of advice. If you're like considering, hey, should I do banking? Should I do consulting? Should I become a lawyer? I just say like, whatever you do, try to equip yourself with AI skills and try to really understand what's happening in this space, so like that your job doesn't get disrupted. And I think, you know, young people should always be more entrepreneurial, always like try to be at the edge of technology instead of like waiting to be disrupted. Another piece of advice in the context of US-China competition, and I hate to say this, but I always tell young people or like my friends, pick a side. Like whether you want to be in the US or you want to be in China, if you want to start a company, if you want to work somewhere, pick a side. Like this is not an era where you could be cross-border, where you can like have a career in both countries. That's going to get harder and harder. I think for young people, they really need to pick a side and like be very clear what the trade-offs are and be very determined to like stay in one country or the other. It's going to be very hard for them. It's not the 2010s anymore. It's going to be hard for them to build a career in both countries.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Another question for Qiheng. Would you say China has much more potential in terms of high quality data, which can be collected from different sources without the concern that we normally have in the West, such as privacy concerns and, you know, GDPR, et cetera, et cetera?
I think that depends on who are the data processors you're looking at and what are the incentive structures. If you look at the PIPL, the Personal Information Protection Law, it has quite a few similar features with the GDPR that you see and pretty robust protection of data privacy in China. But add on to that, I would say there's an emerging view among some of the scholars in China is that the GDPR is too stringent and it actually has a negative effect on innovation. And China definitely doesn't want that. And you're going to see more discretion in terms of how the government is going to enforce the laws, including the PIPL. And they're going to think about who are the winners and who are the losers. They're not going to let everybody worse off. This, if you look at the mobile app transparency requirements and the enforcement on mobile app privacy, and you see the government focus on enforcement on the big players. And there's some research that has emerged saying that it has helped driving up the user engagement rate of those big apps because people trust more of the data privacy being protected at those big apps, and smaller apps benefit from more new download and new users signing up because they're switching away from the big apps. So you're going to just see more practical enforcement that's going to keep an eye on innovation, not just regulation.
Thank you so much, Qiheng. Another question, I'm going to give this one to Karen. How do you see Hong Kong's role in China's AI ecosystem?
It's a great question. I think Hong Kong's role is very confused right now. I think it used to be a bit of a connective tissue in that, you know, Western companies could use Hong Kong as a bit of a launching pad to get into the China market, and Chinese companies could use vice versa, Hong Kong to get out. But at the moment, because there is such a big bifurcation that's happening between the US and China on AI technologies, we're actually seeing a phenomenon where Hong Kong is becoming a bit of a no man's land where no one wants to offer their technologies in Hong Kong anymore because they just don't know what the rules are. So ChatGPT is not offered here. TikTok's not offered here. There's like a lot of other examples that I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but slowly that are sort of chipping away at just Hong Kong not having anything. But on the flip side, I guess the one like positive spot that I do see is there has been a really strong role for a long time of Hong Kong universities doing a lot of AI research and having lots of collaboration with Chinese universities and US universities. And so at least in academia in the open source domain, there is still that connective tissue that's happening through Hong Kong. And I personally hope that Hong Kong does find a way to kind of get out of this no man's land and continue to be the connective tissue on the commercial side. But unfortunately, we're just not seeing that right now.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Karen. And that concludes the Q&A portion of today. Thank you again so much for all our panelists for your insights, and thank you for your time. Until next time, stay engaged, stay curious, and stay informed. Once again, this is the inaugural webinar on US-China Generative AI competition brought to you by the Center for China Analysis of Asia Society Policy Institute. I'm your moderator, Lizzie. Thank you so much for spending the hour with us. This is amazing. And please stay tuned for 2 additional sessions in this series. That's all for today. Thank you so much, and see you next time.